My niece handled my bills while I was recovering from hip surgery, and by the time I realized, $3,850 was already gone. It did not return, and my place in the family quietly shifted. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far this story has reached. I noticed the first number because it didn't match what I expected to see, not because it looked dramatic, not because it looked alarming, but because it sat there calmly, in the same font as always, in the same column, behaving as if it belonged. I had logged into my bank account to check whether the electricity bill had been paid. Something I hadn't done in weeks, maybe longer. The balance was lower than the amount I had in my head, an amount that had been sitting there unchanged since before the surgery. I stared at it for a moment, waiting for my memory to adjust. The way it usually does, it didn't. The number stayed where it was. I closed the page and reopened it. Something I sometimes do when a page loads oddly, even though this one hadn't. The account name was mine. The routing numbers were familiar. The balance didn't move. I scrolled down, slowly. My leg was still stiff, and I'd learned to move carefully in general. The transactions appeared one by one, dated over several months, all labeled as transfers or payments. Small amounts. Individually easy to miss, especially if you weren't looking. They weren't round numbers, they looked practical. They looked like groceries, utilities, repairs. The kinds of things a house requires without asking permission. Besides some of them in the memo field were short notes. House, expense, for bills. None of them were things I remembered agreeing to. None of them were things I immediately rejected either. I didn't add them up right away. I told myself I'd come back to it later, after my leg exercises, after lunch, after I rested my eyes. When I finally did add them carefully twice, the total came to $3,850. I wrote it down on a yellow pad because writing things down still made them feel provisional, like they could change if you handled them correctly. The pen hesitated halfway through the 8. It left a faint hook in the paper. The bank hadn't alerted me. No warnings, no overdraft notices, no calls. The withdrawals were spaced out. They fit into the regular rhythm of the account. The mortgage cleared, the insurance cleared, nothing bounced, nothing screamed. It was only quieter. I sat there longer than I needed to, the laptop balanced on my knees. The charger stretched across the rug because the outlet was too far from the chair I'd been using since the surgery. The room was still. The only sound was the low whir of the ceiling fan. I'd left it on out of habit, even though it wasn't warm. I refreshed the page again, as if the number might correct itself once it realized it was being watched. It didn't. That's when I noticed the most recent transfer, 3 weeks earlier. That meant it had continued even after I was walking more easily, even after I no longer needed help getting to the bathroom or into the car. The timing didn't register emotionally, it registered administratively. 3 weeks was recent enough to feel current, but not recent enough to feel urgent. It sat in that middle space where things often go unanswered. I clicked into one of the transfers. The recipient's name was my niece's, not her full name, just the shortened version she uses on most things. The same name I'd typed into my phone when I was still groggy from anesthesia and she'd leaned over the bed to ask for the banking app password. She'd spoken slowly, kindly, as if I were a child or someone temporarily confused. I remembered nodding. I remembered thinking it made sense. At the time, I told myself this was what family did. The realization that the money was gone didn't arrive with any particular feeling. It arrived the way paperwork arrives, by accumulating. Each transaction confirmed the one before it. Each month confirmed the month before that. I didn't yet understand what it meant, only that the balance had changed and wouldn't be returning to what it had been. It felt like missing a step on the stairs without actually falling. I checked the dates again, as if they might rearrange themselves. April, May, June, July, August, September, 6 months, give or take. I'd been in recovery during the first part, less so during the second. The account didn't reflect that distinction. It treated all the months equally. I opened the folder with my printed statements, the ones that still came in the mail because I'd never bothered to change that setting. They were stacked neatly, still sealed, on the small table by the front door. I carried them back one by one, laid them out on the coffee table, aligned the corners. The act felt important, though I couldn't say why. The paper showed the same thing as the screen, the same transfers, the same amounts, the same notes. Seeing it printed didn't make it more real, but it made it harder to dismiss. Paper insists. I ran my finger down the column of numbers, stopped at the total withdrawals for each month. They varied slightly. No 2 months looked exactly alike. It gave them legitimacy. I noticed the number I'd written earlier, $3,850, looked smaller than usual. Careful, as if it had been asked to behave. There was a brief moment when I wondered if I'd simply forgotten approving these expenses. If the surgery, the medication had blurred more than I realized. The thought came and went. I didn't chase it. The account didn't ask for explanations. It only showed what had happened. I checked the account permissions. There she was, added the day after my surgery. The date sat there in small gray text. I vaguely remembered that day, her bringing soup I couldn't finish. Her saying she'd take care of things for a while. The app confirmed she still had full access. Nothing had changed there either. I considered removing her access then, but it felt premature. Like canceling a service before you understood what it was doing. I told myself I'd look into it later. Later had become a flexible word. Instead, I kept looking. The same calm deductions. The same slow reduction of what had once felt secure. I didn't feel panic. I felt occupied. There were other confirmations that day. A notification that my balance had dipped below a threshold I rarely crossed. A smaller than usual interest payment. A line that read ending balance, followed by a number I no longer recognized. I'd memorized the old one years ago after paying off the house. After promising myself I'd keep that cushion untouched, I made tea, let it sit too long, drank it lukewarm anyway. The routine continued around the discovery. Mail arrived. A neighbor waved through the window. My phone buzzed with a pharmacy reminder for a prescription I'd already stopped taking. Nothing paused for this. At no point did I think this is theft. At no point did I think this is betrayal. Those words belonged to a later stage. What I thought was procedural. How long had this been happening? How much was left? Whether the automatic payments would continue. Whether I needed to move money just to keep things steady. I logged out, logged back in. Checked the balance one last time. Then I closed the laptop carefully, set it on the side table as if it were fragile. My leg had started to ache again, a reminder that I was still recovering, still slower, still dependent. That afternoon, an email confirmed a routine cable payment. It went through without issue. The system was functioning. Money moved where it was told to move. Nothing suggested anything was wrong. I kept glancing at the clock. Even though I had nowhere to be, time passed in ordinary increments. Whatever this loss was, it had already been decided. It sat quietly in the past, spread across dates that couldn't be changed. I was only just arriving at it. Late. Without ceremony, and without yet knowing what it would require of me. By evening, I slid the statements back into their envelopes, returned them to the table by the door. I left the yellow pad on the counter, the numbers still visible. I didn't cross it out, I didn't underline it. It stayed there, waiting. Before the surgery, my life had been organized in a way that felt settled, not rigid, just consistent. Bills were paid on the same days each month. Statements arrived. I checked them, filed them. Nothing required much thought anymore. The house ran quietly. So did I. I'd been careful for a long time, not because I distrusted people, but because I liked knowing where things stood. After the mortgage was paid off, I'd promised myself I wouldn't let that sense of stability slip. I kept a cushion. I didn't touch it. It sat there year after year, unchanged enough that I memorized the number without realizing I had. My niece used to comment on that, not directly, just small remarks. You're very organized. I don't know how you keep track of all this. You're better with paperwork than anyone I know. I took those comments at face value. They felt observational, complimentary maybe, nothing more than that. When my hip finally gave out, it didn't happen dramatically. There was no fall, no accident, just a gradual tightening followed by pain that stopped responding to rest. The surgery was scheduled quickly after that, too quickly for me to reorganize anything beforehand. I remember thinking I'd handle the details afterward. Recovery first, everything else later. Later felt reasonable then. The night before the operation, my niece stayed late. She brought food I barely touched. Sat at the kitchen table while I moved things closer to the edge of the counter so I wouldn't have to reach as far the next day. She asked questions about practical things, utilities, mail, automatic payments. I answered them casually. I didn't think of them as permissions, just information. At some point, she asked how I usually paid the bills. I told her, online. Same account, same routine. She nodded as if filing it away for reference. There was no urgency in her tone, no sense that a line was being crossed, just preparation. That's how it felt. After the surgery, everything slowed down. Time stretched in odd ways, days felt long, weeks blurred. Pain medication dulled the edges of thought. Not enough to confuse me, just enough to make focus feel optional. That's when she offered to help. She framed it carefully. Just while you're recovering, so you don't have to worry. I remember being grateful for the phrasing. It made the help feel temporary, contained. I agreed without much discussion. I gave her access sitting up in the hospital bed. The room smelled faintly of disinfectant. The television was on low, some daytime program I wasn't really watching. She leaned over to see the screen better while I typed. I remember my hands shaking slightly. I blamed the anesthesia. She told me to take my time. There was no rush. When it was done, she smiled, said it was all set. I felt relieved, as if one responsibility had been lifted and placed somewhere safe. I didn't imagine it moving again. Certainly not expanding. When I came home, the house felt different, not unfamiliar, just quieter. I set up camp in the living room, pill bottles on the side table, ice packs in the freezer, a stack of mail I didn't open right away. She checked in regularly at first, texts, short calls. She'd mention things casually. I paid the water bill. Electric's taken care of. I thanked her each time. It seemed appropriate, necessary even. I didn't ask how much things cost. I didn't ask to see receipts. That wasn't how help usually worked in my family. You didn't audit kindness. You accepted it. And you remembered it later. As the weeks passed, I got stronger. Moved from the walker to the cane. From the cane to short, careful walks without anything. The help continued. Quietly, efficiently, nothing called attention to itself. By the third month, I was driving again, not far, just errands. I noticed the mail piling up less. Statements still arrived, but I didn't open them. I assumed there was nothing new to see. The routine was functioning. Why interfere with that? Looking back, that assumption feels important. At the time, it felt harmless. Life before the surgery had been orderly. Life during recovery felt managed. There was no clear point where one ended and the other should have resumed. No announcement, no handoff. I stayed in that middle space longer than I realized. Letting things continue because they had already been continuing. Trusting the process because it had been framed as temporary. Because family had offered. Because nothing appeared wrong. The house stayed warm. The lights stayed on. The account didn't trigger alarms. Everything I could see suggested stability. So I let myself believe it. And that belief quietly carried me forward into something I hadn't yet named. The change didn't happen all at once. That was part of the problem. It repeated itself in small, ordinary ways, the kind that don't demand attention, the kind that fit easily into daily life without interrupting it. Each month, something was paid, a bill cleared, a balance adjusted. I didn't see it happen. I only knew it had happened because nothing stopped working. She would mention it sometimes. Not every time, just enough to keep the idea present. I took care of the internet. I handled the gas bill, always after the fact, always casually, as if it were already settled because it was. I'd say thank you. The words came easily. They were familiar. They didn't feel like agreement, just acknowledgement. And then the moment would pass. There was no single conversation where the arrangement was reviewed. No check-in that said, "Do you still want me to do this?" The help simply continued because it had been continuing. And I allowed that because stopping it would have required a pause, a decision, an interruption of something that looked smooth from the outside. I noticed that I stopped thinking about bills altogether, not consciously. They just drifted out of focus. My attention was on physical therapy schedules, on pain levels, on whether I could make it up the stairs without having to sit halfway. Those things felt urgent. The rest felt handled. Every now and then, I would see a notification on my phone. A payment confirmation. I didn't open them. I registered them the way you register background noise. Information, but not information that needed action. They blended into the day. There was one afternoon, maybe the second or third month, when I thought about checking the account. The thought came while I was making lunch. I remember it clearly because I paused with the fridge door open. I told myself I'd do it later, after I ate, after I rested. I closed the door and the thought didn't come back. Not then, that pattern repeated. A moment of awareness, followed by delay, delay followed by forgetting. Nothing dramatic enough to mark the passage of time, just days stacking on top of each other without distinction. She stopped checking in as often, which made sense. I was doing better. I didn't need rides anymore. I didn't need help showering. The recovery phase was clearly ending, but the administrative part didn't end with it. It simply became invisible. I noticed that she didn't mention amounts anymore. Early on, she sometimes had. Gas went up this month. The water bill was higher than usual. Those comments faded. The payments continued without commentary. They no longer needed justification. I assumed that meant things were normal, that the numbers were within expectation, that nothing required discussion. Assumption became habit without announcing itself as such. Occasionally, I would find myself answering questions about future plans, a repair, a purchase. She would speak as if certain things were already decided. We'll probably do it this way. It makes more sense to handle it now. I didn't challenge those statements. They sounded practical, reasonable. I told myself I could revisit them later. Later remained flexible. The repetition settled into routine. Bills paid, house functioning, me recovering, the system worked. That was the quiet confirmation each month provided. No alarms. No disruptions, just the steady movement of money in directions I didn't track anymore. Looking back, I can see how that repetition mattered more than any single transaction. Each instance made the next one easier. Each month normalized the arrangement. It trained my attention away from oversight, not through pressure, but through absence of friction. There was no moment where I thought, I am losing control. There was only the sense that I didn't need to exercise it. And that idea, once repeated often enough, began to feel permanent. By the time I noticed the loss, the pattern had already been established. Months of quiet confirmation behind it. Months of ordinary days where nothing appeared to go wrong. The change didn't announce itself. It just kept happening, and I let it. I started to feel the conflict before I understood it, not as a clear thought, more like a resistance to certain moments. A hesitation that didn't have a name yet. It showed up when I thought about checking the account again. The impulse would surface, and then something would slow it down. Not fear, not denial, just a sense that looking too closely might require a response I wasn't prepared to make. I told myself I was tired. Recovery was still ongoing, even if the worst of it was over. There were still exercises to do, appointments to keep. I let those things take priority. They felt legitimate, necessary. At the same time, I noticed how careful I'd become in conversation. When my niece mentioned handling something, I didn't ask follow-up questions. I didn't say, how much was it? Or which account did you use? The questions formed and then stayed unspoken. They felt slightly out of place, as if asking them would shift the tone in a way I didn't quite want to manage. Part of me believed that if there were a problem, it would announce itself. A bounced payment, a warning, something concrete. Until then, everything felt theoretical, and theoretical things can be postponed. I also didn't want to appear ungrateful. That mattered more than I expected. She had helped when I needed it. She had shown up. Questioning the arrangement felt somehow like questioning her motives. I wasn't ready to do that. I wasn't sure I ever would be. There were moments when I almost spoke. A pause in conversation, a natural opening. And then I'd fill it with something else. A comment about the weather, about how my leg was feeling. Anything but the thing that was sitting there between us, unacknowledged, waiting. I noticed how the silence around money had become mutual. She didn't volunteer details anymore. I didn't ask. The subject was present but sealed, handled, closed off without being closed. That mutual avoidance felt stable. It allowed the relationship to continue without friction, at least on the surface. And I told myself that was a good thing, that preserving ease mattered, that not everything needed to be examined. Still, there were small moments that unsettled me. Seeing her use my phrase, the house expenses, as if it were standard language. Hearing her speak with certainty about timelines and priorities that I hadn't set. None of it was overt. None of it demanded correction. But it accumulated. I began to notice how often I deferred, not because I agreed, but because I hadn't decided otherwise. That distinction mattered even if I didn't fully grasp it yet. The conflict lived in that space. Between knowing something required attention and choosing not to give it. Between trust and the quiet discomfort of realizing it was being stretched. I didn't frame it as betrayal. I framed it as inconvenience, as something to deal with later. Later remained useful that way. I told myself I didn't want to overreact. That restraint was maturity. That waiting was reasonable. All of those thoughts sounded measured, responsible. They helped me stay still. What I didn't recognize yet was that stillness was also a choice. One that allowed the arrangement to continue unchallenged. One that carried consequences whether I named them or not. The conflict stayed unresolved. Not because it was too large, but because it was too quiet. It didn't demand action, it simply lingered, and I let it. The realization didn't arrive all at once. It came together slowly through repetition, through the same details showing up again until they stopped feeling neutral. I was reviewing the statements one afternoon when I noticed that the earliest transfer had happened sooner than I remembered. Just days after I came home from the hospital, before I'd even managed the stairs on my own. That date had always been there, I'd seen it before, but this time it didn't blend in with the rest. It sat slightly apart. And I understood, not emotionally but practically, that the decision to take money had not followed my recovery. It had started almost immediately, without waiting, without checking what I needed or what I might ask for later. That understanding didn't cause a reaction. It caused a pause. I sat with the statement in my hands and noticed how still I was, as if moving might interrupt whatever was forming. The realization wasn't accusatory, it was observational. I started to see how the language worked. House, expense, for bills. None of it required my input. None of it invited confirmation. It all assumed authority had already shifted. The account reflected that with quiet efficiency. I thought about the hospital room, her taking my phone, entering the information. At the time, it had felt like relief. Now it registered differently, not wrong, just incomplete. There had been no limits discussed, no end date. No mention of oversight. The absence of those things hadn't been accidental. They simply hadn't been addressed. What became clear wasn't her intention. I still didn't try to interpret that. What became clear was the result. Decisions about my money had been made without reference to me, and they'd continued after the practical need had passed. The system hadn't reset. It had settled. I noticed how often I'd chosen ease during recovery. How often I hadn't asked questions because it felt simpler not to. That choice had repeated until it wasn't a choice anymore. It was a condition, and my silence hadn't preserved balance. It had altered it. There was a small moment when this understanding sharpened. A routine email from the bank, a monthly summary. It categorized the transfers as my spending, my decisions. The language was automated, impersonal, final. It didn't distinguish between what I'd done and what had been done for me. I understood then that the record would always read this way. No footnote, no explanation, no note about recovery. The system had already absorbed the change and normalized it. Whatever had happened was now part of the official version of my life. That realization didn't make me angry, it made me still. I stopped looking for alternative explanations, stopped waiting for more information, stopped expecting the situation to resolve itself if I stayed quiet. What I finally saw was that my role had shifted without my participation. I hadn't been consulted when it shifted. I hadn't been asked when it continued. The money was one measure of that, not the only one. The more significant loss was procedural, embedded in routines, in assumptions. I noticed how this changed the way I thought about future interactions. Not confrontations, not corrections, but access. Who had it? Who assumed it? Who no longer needed to ask? The quietness of the realization surprised me. There was no clarity rush, no resolution, just the point where the situation stopped feeling temporary. The loss had already occurred. The question was no longer whether it would be addressed, but how it would be carried. I closed the statement and set it aside. The action felt different this time, less tentative. I wasn't avoiding the information anymore. I'd taken it in. The realization settled not as a conclusion, but as a baseline. From that point on, I stopped thinking of it as something that had happened during recovery. I thought of it as something that had continued afterward. That distinction mattered, even if I couldn't have said why then. Nothing changed externally. The balance stayed the same. The access stayed in place. Family interactions continued, but internally something shifted. I was no longer waiting for the situation to reveal itself, it already had. What remained was the knowledge that my place within the system had changed, and that this change had gone unremarked by everyone except me. The realization didn't demand action, but it did close off certain assumptions. The idea that things would naturally return to how they were, that belief didn't hold anymore. The loss, now understood this way, felt complete. Not dramatic, not explosive, just finished.
The decision didn't arrive as a single moment. It spread out across ordinary days through small actions that didn't look like decisions at all. Nothing was announced. Nothing was shared. From the outside, nothing would have looked different. I started by doing things that felt preparatory, though I didn't call them that then. I opened the account settings again, this time not expecting clarity to appear, just reading. Slowly, transfer limits, user permissions, notification thresholds. Each option sat there, neutral, waiting. I didn't change anything yet. I closed the app and went on with the day. The pause felt deliberate, even if I couldn't have explained why. I wasn't hesitating because I was unsure. I was adjusting to the idea that I didn't need to explain myself in order to act. That thought stayed with me. Over the next few days, I noticed how often I checked the account. Not for new activity, but to confirm there wasn't any. The balance stayed the same. No new transfers appeared. That absence mattered. It suggested that whatever had been taken was already complete. That the pattern had paused it perhaps because it no longer needed to continue. I also noticed how her presence in my life had shifted. She called less. When she did, the conversations were brief, general. She no longer mentioned the house. Or the bills. The role she'd held during my recovery had faded, without discussion. The access, though, was still there. One afternoon, I sat at the desk in the spare room. The chair was stiff from not being used. I logged into the banking app and went straight to the permissions section. This time, I didn't scan. I knew exactly where everything was. I hovered over the option to remove her access, longer than necessary. Not because I was unsure, but because of how simple it was. One action, one confirmation, no justification required. The system didn't ask why. It didn't ask whether I'd discussed it with anyone else. It treated the decision as routine. Before I did it, I checked the transactions one last time. No new entries. The same final transfer I'd already seen. That confirmation mattered. It told me I wasn't reacting to something immediate. I was responding to something settled. I removed her access. The app confirmed it with a brief message. User removed. No explanation, no follow-up. The system moved on. I didn't feel relief. I didn't feel satisfaction. What I felt was a slight easing. Like adjusting your posture after realizing you've been holding yourself wrong. Subtle but unmistakable. After that, I made 2 more changes. I changed the password. I lowered the daily transfer limit. Both took less than a minute. They didn't feel defensive. They felt procedural, like restoring structure, not building something new. I didn't tell her. There was no message to send, no explanation to draft. Internally, the decision wasn't framed as a response to her actions. It was framed as a return to responsibility. That distinction mattered to me. In the days that followed, I waited for some sign that the change had registered elsewhere. A question, a comment, confusion. Nothing came. The silence continued. If she noticed, she didn't say. If she didn't notice, that also told me something. The account stayed quiet. Bills were paid as usual. The balance didn't move. The system adjusted smoothly. It didn't require oversight. It simply resumed under different parameters. I noticed that I stopped checking the app so often. The compulsion faded. Not because nothing had happened, but because I'd reasserted my place within it. The loss remained, but it wasn't ongoing anymore. There were moments when I thought about saying something, about whether silence might be misunderstood. The thought didn't stay long. I recognized it as an old reflex, smoothing things over before they'd had a chance to settle. This time, I let it pass. I noticed how the decision spread into other areas of my life. I opened mail promptly, reviewed statements when they arrived, paid attention. None of it felt reactive. It felt aligned. Family interactions continued, outwardly unchanged. When she spoke, I listened. When she asked how I was, I answered, briefly, honestly. There was no visible strain. The distance that existed didn't announce itself. What had changed wasn't the relationship on the surface. It was my understanding of its boundaries. I no longer assumed shared access. I no longer assumed continuity without renewal. Sometimes I thought about the $3,850. The number stayed precise. It didn't fade, but it no longer felt active. It was fixed, contained. Part of what had already happened. The decision hadn't recovered the money. It hadn't restored trust. It hadn't prompted acknowledgement. What it did was draw a line, one that wouldn't be crossed again, whether anyone else noticed or not. There was a quiet firmness to that, final without ceremony. I hadn't confronted anyone. I hadn't demanded explanations. I'd acted within the system available to me, and the lack of spectacle felt right. From that point on, the situation stopped feeling unresolved, not because it had been addressed, but because it had been placed where it belonged. The decision, made without announcement, settled beside the loss, both of them now finished. The consequences didn't arrive as reactions. They came as adjustments, quiet ones, subtle enough that I might have missed them if I hadn't already been paying attention. Nothing was said. No one asked what had changed. The family simply reorganized itself around a new set of assumptions. The first thing I noticed was how information started moving differently. Plans, expenses, decisions. They reached me later than they used to, if they reached me at all. Not because anything was being hidden, but because there was no longer an expectation that I needed to be consulted. Things were handled elsewhere. Then mentioned, already finished. It wasn't just about money. That surprised me. The financial access had been the clearest shift, but the consequence spread beyond it. I heard about a repair after it was already done. I learned about a purchase once it couldn't be changed. Small things, the kind that rarely need discussion, but they repeated. When I was present, I noticed how conversations moved around me, not through me. Decisions were referenced, not debated. Someone would say, "We already took care of that," and the sentence would close the topic. I didn't object. There was no obvious reason to. The moment would pass. The conversation would move on. My niece's name came up often in these moments, spoken as shorthand. "She's handling it. She already did that." The phrasing was familiar. I'd heard it before during my recovery. Now it was used without reference to me at all. The money had been a fixed loss. This was the ongoing effect. My role as the point of reference had been replaced. Not officially, not ceremonially. It had simply shifted to someone who had already been acting that way. I noticed it most clearly at a routine family gathering. Nothing unusual happened. The food was prepared. People arrived and left at the times they always did. At one point, a question came up about something that affected me directly. The answer was given without anyone looking at me. I was standing there, close enough to hear, close enough to respond if I'd been asked. I wasn't asked. The moment passed quickly. No one seemed aware that it had been a moment at all. I registered it the way I'd registered the bank balance months earlier. Something had been decided without my participation, and it was now being treated as settled. I didn't correct anyone. I didn't step in. By then, watching had become habit. I observed how easily the system adjusted. There was no confusion, no friction. Everything ran smoothly. In the days after that, I noticed changes in expectation. Fewer requests, fewer check-ins. Fewer assumptions that I would be the one to handle things. At first, it felt like relief, less responsibility, less involvement, but that explanation didn't last. What I was feeling wasn't a lighter burden. It was reduced relevance. The financial loss had been a clear event. The consequences were diffuse, spread across omissions, across timing, across what wasn't said. Each one was easy to overlook. Together, they formed something unmistakable. I also noticed how my own behavior shifted. I chose words carefully. I offered opinions only when asked. I stopped giving advice that had once been expected. This wasn't withdrawal, it was calibration. There were moments when I considered reasserting myself, speaking up, reminding people of my presence. Those moments passed. I recognized that doing so would require naming a shift no one else had named. Explaining something that had happened without language, so I adapted. And adaptation had its own cost. Distance. Not hostile, not dramatic, structural. I was still included, still invited, still greeted warmly, but the center had moved. And it wasn't moving back. Sometimes I thought about the $3,850 as the marker of that change, not as a transaction, but as a point in time. The moment when authority began to redistribute itself. The money went first, the role followed. I noticed how my niece spoke to me now. Polite, friendly, slightly formal. In a way she hadn't been before. She never mentioned the bills, never referenced those months. That period existed in a sealed category, unspoken, closed. If she felt anything about the change in access, she didn't show it. The absence of reaction was itself a consequence. It suggested that my decision hadn't disrupted her understanding of her place. That understanding had already adjusted. By then, I didn't expect acknowledgement. The system didn't require it. My awareness of the shift didn't grant me influence over it. The consequence was this: I was no longer central to my own practical affairs within the family. I still owned my accounts, still lived in my house, still carried the history. But the quiet authority I once had, that role had been redistributed, without ceremony. Nothing dramatic marked the change. No arguments, no ultimatums, just the steady accumulation of moments where I was no longer the reference point. The loss had moved beyond money. It had reshaped my position. And once that reshaping finished, it didn't reverse itself. After everything settled into its new shape, life kept going. From the outside, it probably looked the same. I woke up at the same time, made the same breakfast, went for walks that slowly grew longer as my hips strengthened. Recovery finished without any clear marker. The body resumed routines more easily than the family system did. The money didn't return. It stayed gone in a way that no longer surprised me. When I checked the accounts, I stopped comparing them to the old numbers. I accepted the balance as it was. Not because I approved of how it changed, but because it wasn't changing anymore. That stability, even reduced, felt preferable to uncertainty. I adjusted plans quietly, small things, delaying a purchase. Reconsidering a trip I'd once assumed I would take. None of it felt dramatic. They were recalibrations, the kind you make when you realize the margin is narrower. I didn't talk about these changes. They belonged to me. Family life continued. Holidays passed. Birthdays were acknowledged. Photos were shared. From the outside, nothing looked broken. If someone asked, everything would have appeared intact. What had changed lived underneath that surface. I noticed I was no longer asked for advice about practical matters. When I did offer an opinion, it was received kindly, but not always followed. I recognized that shift for what it was, not disrespect, expectation. I was no longer assumed to be the final reference point. That awareness stayed with me, steady, undramatic. It didn't make me bitter, it made me precise. I became more careful about what I shared, not secretive, selective. I didn't volunteer information that could be used to decide things on my behalf. I answered questions directly, without elaboration. Those habits formed naturally, without effort. The aftermath included a quiet independence I hadn't expected. I handled my affairs myself again, fully, without assistance, without commentary. I checked systems, kept records current, paid attention. It didn't feel like vigilance. It felt like ownership. Sometimes I thought about the version of myself who had handed over access so easily, who believed help would remain bounded by circumstance. I didn't judge that version harshly. At the time, it had seemed reasonable, necessary. Recovery requires trust. There isn't another way through it. What I understood later was that trust doesn't always retract itself on its own. It has to be retrieved. And sometimes in that process, you find something else has already gone with it. The family never spoke about those months again. They existed as a closed chapter, referenced vaguely. When you were laid up, after the surgery, no details. No numbers, no mention of money. The financial part had dissolved into silence. That silence wasn't empty. It had shape, structure. I learned how to live inside it without resisting. I didn't try to reclaim my old place. I didn't correct the arrangement. I occupied the position that remained, aware of its boundaries. There was a kind of peace in that acceptance, not comfort, clarity. This is where things are. This is what happened. This is what didn't happen afterward. The aftermath wasn't about healing or reconciliation. It was about adjustment, about recognizing that something had ended quietly and wouldn't be reopened. The money was gone, the role had shifted, the family had adapted, so had I. Looking back now, the surgery feels almost incidental, a condition, not the outcome. The real change happened afterward, in the months when nothing looked wrong, when systems worked, when trust operated without supervision. That's when my place began to change. I still attend gatherings, I still listen, I still care, but I do so from a different position now. One that requires less assumption, more awareness. The aftermath isn't dramatic. It doesn't announce itself. It simply endures, quietly, the way these things do.